Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Fair Trade Unplugged, where we bring you news and views from the world of fair trade and tackling some of the issues that are affecting people, particularly in the global south, as they try and earn their way out of poverty based on their own efforts. So I am absolutely delighted that we've got with us Evans Kissi. So he's going to be chatting to us a little bit about his story and also sharing some of his insights into particularly sustainability, and then we'll try and lead that into a little bit to talk around Fairmade, fair trade, and some of the issues there. So Evans, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm grateful, and it's a delight to have me here.
So let's just introduce you to our watchers. So tell us a little bit about your life story, the journey that you've been on.
Yeah, so my name is Evans Kissi, as you rightly mentioned. I'm originally from Ghana, but currently living in Germany. So I studied in Ghana, I did my bachelor's in Ghana, and then I moved to Germany to do my master's in sustainable international agriculture. Then I did a PhD in also agricultural science, but majoring more on globalization of the agricultural sector, with a bit focus on sustainability issues in the cocoa sector in Ghana. And currently, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Organic Agricultural Sciences at the University of Kassel, within the section called Sustainability Management in the International Food Industry. So I teach here, and I also do research around sustainability management issues in the food sector.
Right. And what made you get into that then? What's driven this journey?
I had always wanted to do something in cocoa. I'd always wanted to do something in the cocoa sector to really understand how the value is created in the cocoa sector and who captures what and who is not capturing what. And the reason is that I also benefited in Ghana in the senior high school from a cocoa bot scholarship. And I have a few family members who are into cocoa farming. I'd always wanted to learn more how cocoa is, and particularly how the value is created and so forth and so on.
Yeah. And cocoa's a major crop in Ghana, isn't it?
Yes, it's a major crop in Ghana, currently the second largest producer after Cote d'Ivoire. Of course, we are being threatened by our position by Ecuador and other countries that are doing very well. But we've actually even been the number one cocoa producer in the 70s and still very strong when it comes to cocoa production.
Right. So what were you hoping for? So obviously you've put a lot of effort, a lot of time, you've traveled more than halfway across the world to end up in Germany. So what's the outcome that you've been hoping for in this journey? Why have you put so much effort into this?
Well, the outcome for me is not only to teach students, future leaders, future sustainability leaders on the challenges of the cocoa sector, but how to transform it, but also to teach and train farmers on some of these sustainability issues. And I'm glad that over the years, I've had the opportunity to do that through the GIZ, the German Development Corporation, if I would translate it that way. And I've had the opportunity to often go back to Ghana since 2021 to train smallholder cocoa farmers on some of these sustainability issues, such as child labor, but also on environmental consequences of pesticide use, and also issues around value addition, living income issues, and so forth and so on.
You just mentioned in passing there the whole child labor issue. So help us understand that a little bit, because as Westerners, obviously we've got the benefit of an education system, we've got welfare systems. So nobody in the UK or Germany needs their kids to go out to work to help their family stay alive. But in somewhere like Ghana, how easy is it for cocoa farmers to actually be sustainable without using their kids' labor?
Thank you, Mark. This is obviously a very big debate out there whether even child labor exists in Ghana or not. I think first to answer your question, I have to say that we need to redefine what child labor is in the first place. But until we get a redefinition, if we go by the ILO's definition of child labor, looking at the age of the child first, but also looking at how you deprive the child of their education, but also looking at the nature of work and then the condition of work, then one would say that you would find some child labor cases in Ghana. Who are usually the victims? Is it the cocoa farmers' children or not? I would say that not necessarily. I mean, the child labor cases can be different forms of children. So it could either be the cocoa farmers' children or relatives or people who have migrated from one part of the country then into the cocoa sector, right? So what actually is the cause of this child labor is multifaceted. And mostly we say it's all about poverty. It's about poverty of the parents of these children who are involved then in engaging in these things. But there's also another aspect which has been lumped into child labor, which I think even needs more than redefinition. Cocoa farmers using their kids on the farm, particularly during vacation or during weekends. Does that also amount to child labor? These are questions that have not, clearly been answered very well in the literature. And the question of whether even such children are paid, do they do that because they want money, or they do that because they want to learn a skill, or they are doing that because parents want to pass on the skill of cocoa farming to them so that in their absence they would be able to do it. But in terms of the definition of how we define child labor, then you would say theoretically, yes, you can identify child labor cases, which in my view sometimes are also a bit exaggerated.
Right. And I think that's what makes me nervous, because here I am sat in the West and it's easy for me to make statements and pontificate, and it can feel very moral and virtuous to say, there should be no child labor. And that makes sense to me. But I think it's understanding what it's really like on the ground in some of the countries where we're buying products from and saying, okay, how do we support them in a way where we're not imposing our Western values on them, but we are encouraging them to, in your language, to be sustainable. And clearly, if a child is being forced to work in the fields and is not being educated, you sort of cap the future of that child, don't you? To say, well, then that's all you'll ever be able to do. And education must be good for them, but it's getting that balance between, do you want to be educated and starving, or working hard but the family is thriving, and finding that balance. And I think that's where, in a way, I feel we need to take a step back, and somebody like yourself who's talking about Ghana, knowing Ghana, having lived in Ghana, that's the roots that you've got. You're always going to be more useful, say, than somebody like me. I just want to support what's happening and to understand it so we know why we're doing what we're doing and why we're saying what we're saying.
I mean, absolutely, because I like that you used a particular term, whether the children are forced or not, and at the moment, it's more an assumption, or we call it more potential risk. You would not really find forced child labor. There might be issues of such, particularly those who are in what we call the debt bondage, which is no longer even the case now in most parts of Africa, I would say. But there are small pockets of the fact that somebody owes somebody, and then he or she would have to send a child to work to pay off that debt. So issues of debt bondage. Other than that, then it begs the question, should we decide for the children? What if a child says, I'm not interested in going through the formal education, but I want to work on the farm, and in future I want to be a big cocoa farmer? What do we term that also as child labor or not? And I think that's something that you rightly hit hit on the head of the nail. And it's a discussion that we need to continue to be able to tell whether that should be included in child labor or not. Even though there are genuine cases of child labor, the exaggeration has to be looked at.
Yeah. So you also mentioned the use of chemicals in the context of sustainability. So help us understand what's the challenges there.
Yeah, so basically, when you look at the use of chemicals, which is something, if I move into organic farming, for example, prohibits, particularly the inorganic types of chemicals or agrochemicals, let's put it that way, whether the fertilizers or the pesticides in general. It is a problem, and you hear Cocoa Board, which is the regulator, often educating farmers on some of these things. The main problem is the use of weedicides, in my view, because cocoa farming can also be a bit laborious, and it's not easy trying to engage in manual forms of weeding. And we've not been able to develop technologies very well, given the nature of how the farms are, to be able to get rid of these weeds for us. And so most farmers usually would want to apply weedicides, which is a very easy form of controlling weeds, I would say. And that normally has then been the challenge, okay? And the challenge is also part of the porous borders that we have. Who is controlling what chemical is coming into the country is also something that you would say it's a challenge. Then there's another type of challenge, which is that even the approved agrochemicals are normally also abused in terms of the dosage that would have to be applied on the farm. Okay, but overall, you see a lot of campaigning and a lot of work done by the different actors to educate these farmers on the right usage of the chemicals, but also on what chemical that is fit for purpose. Okay, but this is not something you can easily root out because people have interest, and sometimes you ask the question, how did they get this particular type of chemical that has not been approved by the government, but then it's in the community? And you can blame it only on interest of people, on our porous borders, people bringing in chemicals that necessarily have not been approved. And these are some of the things we also often educate farmers, that the major solution is to listen to the extension officers that the government or the regulator, which is Cocoa Board here, has employed to educate them and to buy such approved chemicals and to use the right dosage. Other than that, there's always challenges around this, and we see it in some of the beans that are eventually harvested, whether organic produced ones or inorganic produced ones. They all face these challenges of not using the right agrochemicals, but also overusing even the right agrochemicals.
Yeah. And let's say they've got the right chemical, but they're using twice the dose or more than they should. What impact does that have on the quality of the cocoa?
Well, that's a bit more technical question, something I would not be able to answer properly. But in one of my education of farmers, these were organic farmers who I was educating on the consequences of, overusing the approved agrochemical or not using the right dosage. I think what I was told, at least by the company that I trained the farmers, was that this then affects their sales of organically produced cocoa beans. So two things. It's either the buyer in Europe would say, I am not going to pay you the premium because I have seen traces of the pesticides in the beans. And that means, and here I'm not a technical person when it comes to it, but I'm sure then they have to go through a process to reduce that that residue, that pesticide residue in the beans. And so that then affects the premium that would be paid to these smallholder farmers. Right. But also another consequence would be that then the buyers are no longer interested in buying the beans. And I think somewhere in 2017, Ghana had such issue with Japan where they rejected the beans because they thought there were high amount of pesticide residues in it. But overall, I must commend the Ghana government for this. Cocoa Board, because of how the structure is, usually they make sure that all such beans are excluded from the export of quality beans. And so it's not surprising that the government even also has a program which is called the mass spraying program, to make sure that they employ people to engage in the spraying of these cocoa farms, so we reduce the either the wrong dosage or the wrong chemical that are used. But this program also has its own inefficiencies. It doesn't get to all farmers. It's a bit political. And what do you expect? Farmers also are sometimes advised or draw inspiration from what others are doing, and they end up using the wrong chemicals and not using it rightly.
Yeah. So the main mechanism is education. It's not legal enforcement. They're just trying to explain to farmers, look, you need to do this for these reasons, rather than, threatening them with prosecution or something like that.
I mean, for the farmers, yes, it's always been that. And there's also a subtle threat of them not, buying the beans. But then this is even more complex, because the cocoa supply chain in itself is very complex, as we have in Ghana. You have buyers who have license from the regulator, and they go to various cocoa farming communities to buy beans. And usually they don't have the resources to check the quality of the beans. It's the government who would later check the quality. So another form of check is government not paying more to those who do not bring quality beans. But I think at the local level also, the buyers have tried to make sure that they check also the quality of these beans. And the issue of traceability then is a huge problem in the cocoa sector. Something I've seen a number of actors coming together to see how best we can really trace the cocoa to a particular farm and a farmer, so that based on that, you can prescribe what solution to such incidents. So at the moment, it's more not paying premium, it's more not buying from your cocoa beans or not selling it to the international market.
It's just fascinating listening how complicated it is, because obviously I'm reselling fair trade, Fairmade, fairly traded products. And the big challenge for me as the retailer is all my products are more expensive, obviously, than the non-fair trade equivalent. And that's the big sell all the time is, but you can see why it's expensive to be fair trade, just because trying to trace and to, as you say, get back to the actual farm, even where these beans have come from, the amount of auditing, the amount of time investment is huge in order to guarantee that quality, isn't it? And you can see where the fair trade price premium, not the premium paid to the farmers, but the premium that my customers are paying, that can be painful, particularly in an economy that's not booming. But that's what we're paying for, isn't it? Is the huge amount of work it takes to ensure that these beans are being grown properly, safely, sustainably. That's just not a cheap process.
Yes, as you rightly said, it's very expensive to achieve sustainability, right? But if you think about the alternative, then it's better. The alternative of not having a sustainably produced a value chain is worse. But then it's also expensive, and I guess then the message is clear, which I feel a lot of global North consumers are a bit more aware, that paying extra for a particular product that has a label is better, because despite the inefficiencies and the challenges, then that helps to contribute to sustainable production and consumption that we all aim for.
Yeah. It's an interesting, and this is a very philosophical point, but I live in the capitalist Western bubble. I'm not actually at all convinced that capitalism is that great. I think it was Winston Churchill talking about democracy, saying, look, it's a terrible system. It just happens to be better than all the others that we've tried. But the trouble with our Western bubble is we're increasingly short-termist, where sustainability is all about the long game, isn't it? It's more expensive now, but the crop can keep coming. Whereas if we just say, look, let's go for short-term gain and forget sustainability, it's wonderful for a year or two, and then the crop starts to fail or the supply chain starts to break down. So I think we're having to go against a lot of the underpinnings of the way we think in the West to really understand, look, it is painful to pay more for the same thing, but by paying more, this will still be here in 5 years or 10 years. Whereas if we just go for quick wins, that's fine. But then at some point, the whole system's going to break down, isn't it? And it's good to be reminded of it, that that's why we're doing what we're doing. That's why we're pushing so hard to get people to buy fair trade and Fairmade and ethically traded products for all our sakes.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely. I agree with you, Mark. And that should also be then the message, particularly for those who can afford a bit more. It's always
yeah,
good to buy fair trade products or fair made products that support sustainable production. Because I think for me as a teacher and as a researcher, I do not necessarily subscribe to the saying that the business of business is business, right? I think we've moved beyond that. I agree businesses have to make profit, but they also have to be responsible. So that
yeah,
the Nobel Prize winner Friedman was probably not entirely wrong when he said that. But in modern times, the business of business for me is business, society, and the environment. And
yeah,
that would cost a bit more. And we need consumers then to understand that if businesses are to pay more to be responsible for the society and for the environment, then at the end of the day, consumers also would have to pay more to share in that cost. And so if every business would realize that it's not all about maximizing profit is important. That's not what I'm saying. But if we think more than about beyond profit, let's also think about our impact on the society and on the environment. Then that means we all have to pay a bit more for sustainable products.
yeah. I completely agree with that. And I think people come at it from different moral standpoints. For me, it's faith driven, where it's just, this is not the way the planet was created. It's not what it was created for. And, profit enables people to buy houses and cars and clothes and food. So profit is not a bad thing, but it needs to be constrained by other drivers, call that morality or ethicality, sustainability, or just common sense, if you like. And I think this idea that businesses are having to reimagine their role in society, I think that's very, very exciting, is to say we're not just profit generators. That's part of what we do, but we are society designers in that sense, and we have to. At the moment, it's like we make as much profit as we can, and then out of guilt, we give that profit charitably and often very inefficiently back to the places that have been pillaged to make the profit in the first place. But aid, it has a place, of course, and if a society has collapsed, there's been a natural disaster, aid is all there is, isn't it? But it's very quickly turns toxic and builds dependency and messes with all of the mechanisms of self-worth and nobility and working your way out of poverty. So I'd like to see charity become unnecessary. That's probably overly idealistic, but we can do the same thing by just not pillaging in the first place, just not demanding lower prices beyond the cost of production, and say, look, we'll take less profit every time we sell something, but that in turn can then keep societies able to sustain themselves, and that would obviate the need for charitable giving. So I think that's the thing that's driving me the most, is say, how do we do good things but in a very different way?
Mm, mm. And that's obviously a good drive. It's always important that we're able to do things differently in a sustainable way, particularly if you bring in the idea of faith that you talked about. There's this popular saying that there's no shortcut to heaven, and
Yes.
and I think that short-term goals don't help. As you said, aid is important, but we need to tackle root causes of issues other than just incremental, changes that we often aim for. And that's what aid does. That's what some of these things do. That's what, if you focus too much on profit, that's what it's going to do. Okay, it will be a bit more incremental, but not transformative. But if we really want to address root causes of some of these unsustainable practices, then we have to think more from a systems perspective that is able to transform the entire system, other than just quick incremental gains.
Yes, definitely. So we've talked about chemicals. That's an obvious one. We've talked about child labor. What else is in your sustainability concepts? What else is there that you think will make the future better for people in Ghana?
Well, thank you. I think I would have come to one concept, which is also called living income or living wages. At least if the child labor will tackle the social aspect, the use of pesticides we talked about, then it's about the environmental dimension. Then we need to think then about the economic dimension. And so I would then say the other thing then would be issues of living income, living wages for the smallholder farmers. And this then comes back to those who are buying, if they are willing then to pay fair income to the farmers, or to source right sourcing practices. We just talked about consumers required to pay a bit more for sustainable products. And we also think that then the buyers, those who buy the cocoa, especially the global north actors, are also then required to pay a bit higher for the smallholder farmers. So that would be a term I would also think that it's interesting and necessary to look at: living income and living wages.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a long time ago, I used to be a business consultant, and we used to use a video as part of one of our leadership courses about a guy called Mohammed Yunus, who founded Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. And this is many years ago that this happened, but he went back to his home village where most people were in poverty, calculated how much capital was required to enable each of them to earn their way out of poverty. And it was $50, which, even if that's 20 years ago, that's such a small amount of money. And he said people, for the most part, are not poor because they want to be poor or have chosen to be poor. They just can't access the money that they need in order to work their way out of poverty. And I think seeing that's the reason why some of the products we're selling are that bit more expensive, we can think of that as to say, but that's how we put money in the hands of people who know what to do, want to do it, are happy to do it, don't want charity, don't want to be dependent. We're just giving them a chance, aren't we, to say, all right, here's what you need, you know what to do, and the rest is up to you.
Yeah, I mean, I also know about that story, and I think even in today's world, it's a very important concept by the Grameen Bank, which has really helped a lot. And that also is in sync with sustainability. Because usually sustainability has two notions of justice, as we call one intra-generational justice, and the other one intergenerational justice. The intergenerational justice, for example, focuses more on the environment, which is that we should not compromise the ability of future people to also have their own means of survival. So that means we should not destroy the resources that we use. That's the inter. Then there's the intra, which also says that, but we should also take care of the people who are here. And priority should be then on the poor. The poor. Yeah. So that if we use the cocoa and chocolate value chain, it's clear that the smallholder farmers are usually the poor amongst all the actors. Why? they capture less value. They make less than 7% of the value of a chocolate bar in Europe or in America. Of course, I need to say that it is not as if the retailers picked the cocoa beans and sold the raw beans to make that amount of money. We need to acknowledge that they also added value to it. They also spent some resources in doing it. And so it's not surprising that they would capture more of the income than the smallholder farmers. But the inequality is too huge. And I think this is what then, if we believe in the concept of, prioritizing the needs of the poor, and if we are able to pay a bit more to the farmers, if we're able to know how much do they need to survive as a farmer with one wife, with 3 kids, then the living income and living wages, if we're able to address that, then they would also have the desire to practice more sustainable farming. Because if you're not paying them well, then it's very difficult to tell them not to use the pesticides, not to use those fertilizers, because in their view, that would help them to increase their productivity. Then it's difficult to tell them not to use the kits, not to use forced labor, because then in their view, they don't have to pay for the laborers, and that would then help them to gain more. So intra-generational justice is something that, as we think a bit more about sustainability, should also be the focus. I think intergenerational justice has received more attention because of the issues of climate change, which is beautiful and important, but we should also begin to, focus a bit more on the poor. We need to prioritize the poor in these value chains that we often discuss, to see how best we can also help them to achieve a living income.
Yes. Oh, that excites me hugely. I have a Dutch side to my family, and the Dutch seem to have sayings for just about everything. But one of the sayings that I picked up from them, given that they're dairy based largely, is happy cows give you more milk. And I used to use that again in my consulting to say, lots of businesses think that if we install more software or run an Excel spreadsheet, that's how you make your people efficient, which of course is absolute nonsense. We focus on the people and get people feeling like they're able to achieve, given the resources they need to achieve, and they will do the rest. So happy cows give you more milk. And I think this intra-generational, it is the missing piece, because you can't write a spreadsheet for you. People are complex and difficult to define, but we know some basics, which is give them the environment, give them the tools, give them the vision. People are just extraordinary, aren't they? And they can do all kinds of things beyond what we could expect.
That's true.
It leads me, interestingly, as well, when I launched We Are Fair Trade, I was talking about this idea of, listen, it's great that we're controlling the price paid for ingredients, but as you're saying, that means roughly 7% of the price of a bar of chocolate we're buying on a British high street has probably landed with the people who produced the key ingredients. But then all the other processes, the value add, as you're talking about it, they're done at European profit levels, which is expensive. But it must surely be possible to, instead of exporting cocoa from Ghana, why don't we make the chocolate bar in Ghana? And obviously Made in Africa chocolate, you're familiar with them. I'm selling those chocolate bars. And this idea of Fairmade, where, look, let's do as much of the manufacturing, as much of the processing, the printing, the packaging in the source country, that must leave more money with the people who really need that in order to thrive. Obviously, the economies of scale aren't working very well at the moment because it's small scale production, but at some point we should be able to buy a bar for a reasonable price that leaves a much bigger percentage of its money in the source country. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, Mark, I think it's great. Any form of idea or model that tries to challenge post-colonial structures, I think it's good. And if you look at the history of cocoa and chocolate, it's clear that it was designed that the cocoa would be produced in the global south, and then it would be shipped to the global north for the value to be added to it. And so that one interesting thing is that cocoa itself originated from somewhere in Latin America. What we at least know is that then the British that colonized Ghana were more interested in it. And it's not surprising. The first company that made chocolate in the world is it a Fry company or so from England?
Fry's.
Yep. So it means that people or the British encouraged us to produce cocoa beans and ship the raw beans to them for it to be made into chocolate, if you put it that way. So if there's this new idea of saying that, well, let's challenge that post-colonial structures, or let's challenge that colonial structures in that sense, then I think it's good that we encourage such things. Maybe we cannot force all the big chocolatiers like Nestle or Mars or Ferrero or Mondelez to set up structures in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, or those producing countries. But at least we can encourage the emerging companies, the startups, the new models, to consider adding value to this product in the country of origin. And a beautiful example is with the Made in Africa that you mentioned in Ghana and Madagascar. And I think this would be helpful in so many ways, in terms of creating job opportunities for the teeming youth in these countries. That is more of a direct benefit of such a concept. Okay, but I even also see a bit more of indirect benefits of such a system. And if you look into the economic literature, there's something called horizontal linkages, right? What it means is that if we have more people being trained to understand how cocoa beans is processed, how value is added, they can transmit this into other products. They can immediately, shift this skill that they would get into adding value to other products. Okay. Yes. Then there is also something called the consumption linkages. Traditionally, chocolate eating is not something the global south are interested in. Of course, it's developing a lot in Asia. It's increasing also in Africa, like Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, because of the emergent middle class that we have. But it's still not something that it's part of us, like you would say in Switzerland or in Germany or in the UK, where they love to eat chocolate at every moment. But once you begin to add value to the product in the country of origin, people begin to see the process, then there's the desire to begin to taste it, then it would increase consumption of chocolate, which also has health benefits and so forth and so on. So adding value to the country of origin also could result in what we call the consumption linkages. Yeah. And in that case, there's the tendency to increase more chocolate consumption in Ghana, And there's one company that is living this reality, and it's a pity they are not yet part of the Fairmade group, which is they are called Fair Afrique. They set up the factory right in the heart of a cocoa growing community, and they have begun to produce chocolate that would suit the taste of these local communities. And it's begun to increase the desire to, consume chocolate, which has a lot of health benefits. And then at the end of the day, it helps to improve the local economy, right? Imagine you set up small processing cocoa factories in almost every cocoa growing sector. It's going to boost the local economy. They would have to hire people from different parts of the country. It's going to help to increase food production, food consumption. And at the end of the day, simply put, it's going to help to improve the local economy. So such a concept is what we need to help in all the alternative ways of, bridging the income inequality that we have in most of these agricultural export value chains.
Yeah. Well, Evans, I get the impression we could probably talk the whole day. You're just full of passion, full of knowledge, full of enthusiasm. It's been absolutely fantastic to talk to you, and I appreciate you giving us your time. And hopefully we might bring you on and talk about some more issues on another podcast. But thanks so much, Evans.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for having me, and it's a pleasure.